Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 11 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, but we're going to begin with matchups, talking about which defenses have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a full PPR league or a standard league. After giving you guys a little bit more perspective as to which one of these wide receivers we must play due to matchups and the cornerback coverages that they will be seeing this week, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 wide receiver rankings. Of course, talking about them individually. Now, you can see immediately to the right of me, we have a visual representation of our top 18 wide receivers. I'll go ahead and give you guys my opinions and the statistics that justify why I have these players ranked as such on an individual basis, giving you guys as much information as I possibly can so that you can make the best possible decision going into Week 11 to capture a victory in this given week. Again, we are getting very close to the fantasy football playoffs beginning in Week 15. Every victory counts henceforth to potentially getting you into that playoff spot. If in fact you need to win out, this is going to be vital. Either way, even though you can see the top 18 wide receivers on screen to the right of me, remember, rankings are subject to change. As the week progresses, there is going to be injury information, whether it's on the offensive side of the ball or defensive side of the ball, that can certainly change variables and change these rankings. If you're trying to stay up to date on my latest content, specifically via rankings, you can go ahead and join us on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be live streaming like we do every Sunday morning for 2 hours, answering questions with updated rankings on screen for free for those of you who are interested in setting your lineups and getting ready to go. Kick off with Kirchhoff, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Thank you very much. Now, if you're looking for more content on a daily basis outside of a Sunday morning live stream, perhaps a Saturday afternoon live stream after the Thursday night football game, or daily rankings, trade targets videos, all of that coming in your direction from mine, be sure to go ahead and subscribe down below. Certainly does help out the channel, and it definitely helps you potentially capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. So go ahead and do so today. Thank you very much. All right. So as you guys can see, of course, we have the rankings here. We'll transition back into talking about some of these players in just a moment, but I want to begin by talking about matchups going into Week 11. Of course, as you can see on screen, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. The Pittsburgh Steelers give up the most points per week on average to opposing wide receivers in terms of receiving statistics alone, isolating receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Denver Broncos, the Indianapolis Colts. We know how great their cornerbacks have been. Guys like Patrick Surtain, guys like Isaiah Rodgers, of course, Stephon Gilmore for the Indianapolis Colts. There's a lot of stud cornerbacks on the bottom of this list. While on the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have some of these teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, Atlanta Falcons, Tennessee Titans that have either dealt with a lot of injuries this season in the secondary or quite frankly just aren't talented enough in the matchups they have faced. Going into this week, we of course want to take advantage of the upper tier matchups, but in the case of some of these more difficult matchups, for example, Davante Adams having to take on the Denver Broncos, I'm not so worried about it considering he's an elite level talent. But when we talk about the second wide receiver of the Denver Broncos, like a Mac Hollins, that makes it a little bit more difficult for me to go ahead and fire a player like that up in this given circumstance. Either way, we'll refer back to these rankings throughout the course of today's video as we're going ahead and giving you guys a 1 through 5 star designation on every single player's page as such. In the case of Justin Jefferson, of course, he has a 4-star matchup going up against the Dallas Cowboys as they're giving up 27.09 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers this year. Of course, a 1-star matchup is the worst possible within a given week, while a 5-star matchup is a must start in that given circumstance. All right, let's get into talking about our top 36 wide receiver rankings for this week, beginning with Justin Jefferson. Of course, we know he's a must start, but just to kind of give you guys a little bit more details on the matter. He takes on the Dallas Cowboys, and most recently, we've seen a lot of success against this secondary. Of course, a couple weeks back, we saw Cooper Kupp, 7 catches, 125, and a touchdown. And when we're talking about this offense and the way that Justin Jefferson is being utilized, with Kevin O'Connell as the new head coach / offensive coordinator, they've wanted to use Justin Jefferson as the next Cooper Kupp. As we have all season long, I expect to see very similar utilization, specifically the way that Kupp was utilized against Dallas in the way that they use Justin Jefferson. But not only that, we have seen A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith both in the same game score a touchdown against the Dallas Cowboys defense. And of course, most recently this last weekend, we saw Christian Watson with a handful of catches, but 3 receiving touchdowns and over 100 receiving yards, making a lot of plays down the field against his secondary. Now, of course, we know that he's going to be a fantastic play this week, but when we're looking at Prize Picks in the current entry that he's at, 95.5 receiving yards, picking more or less on a given player statistic, this is an absolute smash in terms of picking more. In the last 6 consecutive games, Justin Jefferson has surpassed this total with 147, 154, 107, 98, 115, and of course this last week, 193 total receiving yards. I believe that this is an absolute more play on an upcoming given entry. For those of you who haven't checked out PrizePicks, there's a link down in the description. When you sign up today using promo code Andrew, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So check that out today. Down in the description is the link, and you can go ahead and put together some entries via PrizePicks, specifically having Justin Jefferson going more than 95.5 receiving yards. All right, now that we've talked about him, let's go ahead and transition talking about Davante Adams. Even though it is a one-star matchup going up against one of the best corners in the league, we got to remind you guys that back in week 4, Davante Adams took on this matchup, and quite frankly, he was successful, putting up 15 fantasy points where he had 9 catches for 101 receiving yards against this secondary. Of course, he's going to find success, and in that given week, he had 13 total targets, and that looks very similar to what we've seen over the course of the last 2 weeks. Now that we have Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller out, and I know they were still limited when they were active, but when we're talking about the last 2 weeks of production that we have seen, Davante Adams have access to, the amount of opportunity, 31 total targets that led to 19 catches, 272 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 54.7 fantasy points in just the last 2 games alone. Absolutely a must-start play, and even in this matchup, even though it's difficult, Davante Adams is far too good at his job to mess this up. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb, our number 3. I believe the fantasy gods have heard us. I prayed for months, years, I would actually say, that CeeDee Lamb was going to be the outright number 1 within this offense. And he was going to get himself 10 plus targets. And he was going to be on a consistent rate at that. He got himself 15 targets for 11 receptions, 150 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns against the Green Bay Packers secondary on Sunday. Just the volume of opportunity that he received was unbelievable. And I thought to myself, has CeeDee Lamb ever seen these kind of numbers before? And the fact of the matter is that he hasn't. That performance was not only a career high in terms of total receptions and receiving yards, but he tied his career high in targets and receiving touchdowns in that singular game. That level of opportunity is always going to lead to success, especially when we're talking about elite level talent at the wide receiver position. This week, he takes on the Minnesota Vikings, of course. Stefon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, they both went for 18 fantasy points against this defense just on Sunday. CeeDee Lamb should be able to have himself a great performance. And quite frankly, in his career against the Minnesota Vikings, he has shown himself to be a fantastic option. 14 plus points in both those contests. He's only going to be better this upcoming week. Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs takes on the Cleveland Browns. Now, the rumor around the entire National Football League is that this is going to be a snow game. Now, we heard that last week's game in Buffalo was going to be a snow game, and I didn't see a single sign of the weather being a problem in that contest. But I'm beginning to hear that we're going to see an actual impactful snow weather game. We'll see by the time we get to Sunday if, in fact, that isn't something that is going to potentially deem Stefon Diggs a lesser play. Of course, he's an automatic start. We're talking about a guy that has had 100-plus receiving yards in 6 out of his last 9 games. And even though he's putting up great performances, they could even be better. The unfortunate nature of this offense is that in the last 3 games, in the second half, they have only scored 4 field goals. They have not scored a singular touchdown in the second half of their last 3 games. That's 12 total points as an offense, and that is not going to get it done, especially when they're trying to go ahead and come back in some of these games because they're losing leads. If the Buffalo Bills can get back on track, the weather is going to be pleasant enough to get the job done. I expect Stefon Diggs to be a fantastic play going up against the Cleveland Browns secondary. Moving on, let's talk about DeAndre Hopkins. A couple of stats that we have to, of course, mention. Besides the fact that this season, he is averaging the most targets per game amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League since returning from his suspension, averaging 11.5 targets per game. Not only that, he has a 78.3% catch rate within those 11 targets per game. That is an unbelievable number, and there are very few wide receivers at this current moment in time that are even contesting him within those given statistics. Not only that, last season when he had the privilege of taking on the San Francisco 49ers when he was healthy, 9 targets, 6 catches, 87 yards and a touchdown, 17.7 fantasy points. A great overall performance. Now, whether it's going to be Kyler Murray or Colt McCoy this week, it doesn't really bother me. We saw Colt McCoy, of course, litter DeAndre Hopkins with targets against the LA Rams secondary, and I absolutely believe that he'll do the same once again this week against the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, in the singular game that he started against the 49ers last year, Colt McCoy, when Kyler Murray was down with an injury, he had an 85% passing completion percentage against that secondary. I think this is an automatic play once again. DeAndre Hopkins is a stud wide receiver. Moving on to T. Higgins, our number 6. T. Higgins takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers, the best matchup technically going into this week. From all the rumors that we've heard, Jamar Chase is still dealing with that injury and still on crutches. Now, what exactly does that mean? That means a lot more opportunity in the receiving game for one T. Higgins. Throughout his entire career, when he has been healthy against the Pittsburgh Steelers, meaning he has not left early with the game, and he has been with Joe Burrow in those specific contests. He put up 20.4 fantasy points and 19.0 fantasy points. And those are fantastic numbers. And to be totally honest, I'm expecting him to build up another week here where it's quite similar to those overall fantasy point contributions. Mainly because when we go back to week 1, yes, T. Higgins earlier this season got hurt and left that game early. Jamar Chase, in his absence, went for 16 targets, 10 receptions, 129 and a touchdown, 23.9 fantasy points and a half PPR. In fact, in that game, if Jamar Chase had a shoe size of 1 smaller than he was currently wearing, he would have had 2 more other touchdowns. There's a lot of upside here within this given week against the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary. I think Joe Burrow off the bye week should be on fire and lighting it up with T. Higgins. Moving on to A.J. Brown. Now, many of us were upset about the fact that A.J. Brown did not have a great performance on Monday night against the Washington Commanders when it was such an advantageous matchup in itself. That being said, we have to remember that he did pull his hamstring on that route where he caught his only reception. Obviously, he did come back into the game and was getting himself some participation, but once you go ahead and you tweak something, you're never the same for the remainder of that game. Going into this week, again, it is tougher coverage going up against a guy like Isaiah Rodgers or Stephon Gilmore, 2 of the highest graded overall cornerbacks thus far in coverage via Pro Football Focus. That all being said, in seasons past, we have seen A.J. Brown find him success against the Indianapolis Colts, but it's been with different secondaries. So we can't really have any sort of context clues as to what kind of a performance he's going to put together based on what we've seen in the past when he was with Tennessee taking on Indianapolis. But what we can take into account is the fact that we've seen wide receivers such as Terry McLaurin, F1, 6 receptions, 113, 0 touchdowns against the secondary. Davante Adams this last week, 9 catches, 126 and a touchdown. Elite level wide receivers are going to find success against the secondary. That's why I believe in A.J. Brown. Moving on, let's talk about Amon-Ra St. Brown, the thumbnail for today's video. Amon-Ra St. Brown he's getting back on track. And this is exactly what we anticipated. 10 catches on 11 targets, 119 receiving yards. Just to put it in perspective, this last weekend, Amon-Ra St. Brown consisted of 42% of the team's targets. He consisted of 53% of the team's total receptions and 50% of the team's total receiving yards. He is literally getting to a point where he is 50% of this total offense in the receiving game. And then the rest of these receivers take care of the rest, whether it's DJ Chark coming back, Josh Reynolds potentially coming back and pulling a little bit of pressure off of him. But either way, Amon-Ra St. Brown, of course, a must-start play. Over the course of the last 3 games that he's participated in, weeks 8 through 10, he's gotten himself a 33.7% target share within this offense. Absolutely going to be another destructive, explosive play here. Hopefully finds the end zone. Moving on to Terry McLaurin at number 9. I talked about Terry McLaurin F1 in just, a couple of slides ago in regards to a couple of performances that he's had as of late. But when he has been with Taylor Heinicke, he's been a completely different wide receiver. In the last 4 games, he's averaging 9 targets, 6 catches, 93 receiving yards, and 0.25 receiving touchdowns. So 1 touchdown in the last 4 contests, which honestly is great. Averaging 13.58 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time. And as long as we continue to see Taylor Heinicke as the starting quarterback of this organization, I expect to see a lot of success. And even though they're taking on the Houston Texans secondary, which really haven't given up very many points to opposing wide receivers, it mainly has to do with the fact that everyone runs the ball against Houston. They're going to go ahead, hit him up with the play action, get Terry McLaurin as much utilization as they possibly can. Those targets are going to be there because, quite frankly, Taylor Heinicke's not throwing the ball to any of his other receiving options at a consistent enough rate to make them relevant. Moving on, Jakobi Meyers is number 10. You may be thinking, Andrew, is it crazy to have Jakobi Meyers here? Listen, I'm unique. This is the way I think this is going to pan out. I mean, the last time we saw Jakobi Meyers within this offense against the New York Jets defense in week 8, 13 targets, 9 catches, 60 yards, and a touchdown. And I'll tell you the primary reason that that's the case. When any quarterback is going up against the Jets secondary, they have to be careful of Sauce Gardner and, of course, Reed, the other secondary cornerback. Those guys have been locked down this year. They've both played fantastic football. And it's obviously difficult to throw the ball against them. But when you're talking about a wide receiver that's going to slip primarily in the slot position, which is Jakobi Meyers, and he's going up against Michael Carter II. Yes, Michael Carter is a running back and a cornerback on the Jets. There's 2 different people, okay? But Michael Carter II is a slot cornerback, typically plays in their nickel formation. So thus far this season, he has allowed 37 targets, 31 receptions, 295 receiving yards to opposing slot receivers. He would rank as literally the number 6 best matchup in terms of going up against the slot corner. This is an advantageous matchup for Jakobi Meyers. He should be able to pop off once again, putting up 16.5 fantasy points against the New York Jets just a couple weeks ago. Should be able to lock in coming off the bye. Moving on to Parris Campbell. Parris Campbell's in a tricky situation because, yes, I absolutely trust Parris Campbell, but now it's a matter of me trying to convince you to trust him going into this week. In the last 3 games that he has played with Matt Ryan, and I mentioned this on Monday's waiver wire video, he has averaged 11 targets, 8 receptions, 68 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown per game over the last 3 games. Now, yes, they haven't been consecutive because Matt Ryan got benched because of the injury. But that all being said, he's been averaging 16.77 fantasy points per game in the last 3 contests with a starting Matt Ryan. Not only that, like we mentioned on Monday's video, in the last 103 passing completions that Matt Ryan has had, 74 of them have consisted of the completion being less than 10 yards down the field. He's looking towards the direction of his slot primary wide receiver, and that is Parris Campbell. And for those of you looking at the Philadelphia Eagles matchup and worrying, don't worry. Avonte Maddox, the primary slot cornerback of this defense, is out. He's on the injured reserve. And their backup that is filling in for him has not played well at all this season. He's one of the lowest graded cornerbacks in coverage, according to Pro Football Focus. I think this is a perfect recipe for success for Parris Campbell going into Week 11. Moving on, let's talk about Courtland Sutton to close out our wide receiver ones. Courtland Sutton will have the benefit of the fact that he's taken on this defense before. He's found success against them. His lone touchdown this year has been against the Las Vegas Raiders secondary, putting up 13.7 points against that defense last time, 5 catches, 52 yards, and a touchdown on 7 total targets. But the fact that he will no longer have Jerry Jeudy in this offense, specifically in this week, because of the high ankle sprain that potentially may hold him out for a couple weeks here, assuming it's not too significant, I think there's a perfect recipe here, similar to the way he did last week, 11 targets, 6 catches, 66 yards, hopefully expanding upon that and completing more of those overall passes, assuming Russell Wilson's going to play better. That all being said, the offensive line for the Denver Broncos is battered. They do not have much talent up front any longer due to the injuries that they have sustained. That being said, that may lead to them running the ball less, throwing it more. And when you're throwing the ball against the Las Vegas Raiders of all teams, you're going to find success on a given weekly basis. Moving on, let's talk about Brandin Aiyuk, our number 13. Brandin Aiyuk has had an incredible 4-game streak here. 4 consecutive games of 6 or more receptions and 4 consecutive games of 81 or more receiving yards. In fact, I mean, when you just look at the last couple weeks here, he's averaging over 13 fantasy points per game with Jimmy Garoppolo. He's scoring himself touchdowns, and he's primarily the number 1 receiving option within this offense. I mean, George Kittle, he'll be inconsistent, and quite frankly, so has Deebo Samuel, considering he's not only been inconsistent, but has also dealt with an injury as of late. Aiyuk is the guy. Even when you go back to last season, when Brandin Aiyuk was finally out of Kyle Shanahan's doghouse, the guy went off against the Arizona Cardinals secondary. 8 targets for 6 catches, 89 yards and a touchdown, 15.7 fantasy points. Looks very similar to what we've seen over the course of the last 4 weeks. Hoping it's going to continue to be the case going into this week. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr., our number 14. Again, talking about the second Indianapolis Colts wide receiver. Because Matt Ryan is the starting quarterback, we can actually have hope that these guys have value. With Sam Ehlinger, there's no hope in any sort of capacity, and we witnessed that already this season in the 2 games that he played. But in the last 3 games that Michael Pittman has played with a starting Matt Ryan, he's averaged 11 targets, 9 catches, 82 yards, and 0 touchdowns per game. Overall, those are incredible numbers, 11.83 fantasy points per game on average, and he hasn't even found the end zone in those last 3 contests. Imagine when he has the opportunity of going up against a secondary like the Philadelphia Eagles, who have given up their fair share of touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, and great performances against guys like Terry McLaurin, who put up over 100 receiving yards earlier this week on Monday night, and even earlier this season against the Philadelphia Eagles, put up over 100 receiving yards. There's a lot of potential to be found here. I think Michael Pittman will get back on track once again here with the high target volume and potential red zone success. Let's talk about Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore has been just unbelievable over the course of the last couple weeks. And now that we have a week here where there's not a guarantee that Hollywood Brown plays, and Zach Ertz is gone out for the rest of the season, it is unfortunate. But Rondale Moore is going to have so much potential for opportunity. He's coming off of a week in which he played 66 of the total 68 offensive snaps. That's a 97% snap percentage. Unbelievable. 13 targets, 9 catches, 94 yards. But this isn't, quite rare, to be totally honest. Since week 8, he's been averaging 14.9 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, while he's getting himself an average of 10 targets, 8 catches, 85 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown in those last 3 games. Incredible performances going in his direction, and as long as he's one of the 2 primaries, I think he's going to have himself another big game here, regardless of whether it's Kyler or Colt McCoy. Moving on to Allen Lazard, number 16. With Christian Watson having himself a breakout performance, I believe it's going to pull coverage. Certainly is. Defenses cannot allow Christian Watson to go one-on-one against their secondary corners. They can't. He's just too fast, too athletic, too big. And if you're going to go ahead and pick your poison, they're probably going to allow Allen Lazard to get majority of the yardage, because we know that Allen Lazard isn't going to have home run potential. He's going to trickle down the field and find success. Since week 2, we have seen this, and he has found himself a lot of fantasy production, averaging 11.7 fantasy points per game since week 2, getting himself 7 targets per game, 59 receiving yards, and of course 0.6 receiving touchdowns per game. Great stats overall. They take on the Tennessee Titans tomorrow night. That defense is I mean, they're battered. They're injured. They were missing a bunch of starters on Sunday against the Denver Broncos. Now we have Caleb Farley going to the injured reserve. There are so many members of that defense and secondary that are going to be out. I absolutely believe that Allen Lazard, going into this week, coming off of a victory, should have himself another great performance here. Let's talk about Tyler Boyd at number 17, taking on a division rival in the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tyler Boyd, in week 1, had himself a great performance against this defense, putting up 11.3 fantasy points. Now, that being said, that was done without T. Higgins in the lineup. This upcoming week, they will not have Jamar Chase, and that could be another opportunity for Tyler Boyd to step up and get a little bit more of a target opportunity that will eventually lead to fantasy success. But in the last couple games that we have seen him without Jamar Chase, he's only put up 11.3 and 6.9 fantasy points. Of course, one of those games against Carolina where Joe Mixon had literally all the touchdowns and Tyler Boyd was 1 yard short of scoring a touchdown, was pushed out of bounds on the 1 yard line. If in fact we see a situation where Tyler Boyd, of course, is going to get himself his target opportunity, this is going to be an exciting back and forth game in which, of course, the Cincinnati Bengals are lighting up through the air. Tyler Boyd, I expect to see him score a touchdown at very base minimum. I don't know if the yardage is going to be there, but he'll find the end zone because he has a knack for doing so. Moving on, let's talk about our number 18 to close out the first half of the conversation of the wide receiver position today with Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson has truly been a different wide receiver over the course of the last 2 games that he has participated in. One against the New England Patriots and the other one against the Buffalo Bills. 2 great secondaries and 2 great defensive coaches, yet Garrett Wilson has been unbelievable. In the last 2 games, he's put up 6 catches for 115 yards and 8 catches for 92 yards. Of course, the game against the New England Patriots in Week 8 totaled for 14.5 half PPR fantasy points. I know this is a difficult matchup, and I understand that this offense wants to be a run-first scheme, but based on the production, the amount of opportunity he continues to get within this offense, whether it's through the air, on the ground, Garrett Wilson's a fantastic play going into this week's matchup. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about our number 19 through 36 wide receivers. Like I mentioned earlier today, if in fact injuries are to, potentially impact a player and they're not going to play, that is going to change their ranking. If we do end up seeing Hollywood Brown potentially on Monday night, or potentially see Keenan Allen and Mike Williams return to the lineup this upcoming week, we're going to potentially see them amongst these players, if not higher within the rankings. Either way, understand that rankings are subject to change. This is currently the visual representation as of Wednesday of week 11, just to kind of give you guys an idea. Beginning with our number 1, a guy that, like we talked about, is in a little bit of a situation in regards to maybe he's not fully healthy, and we don't know that as of right now. Obviously, took a severe concussion last Sunday, but if in fact he can clear concussion protocol, he's someone that I want in my lineup, absolutely, because the 3 prior games to his injury, weeks 6 through 9, the guy was averaging 8 targets, 7 catches, 108, and had himself an 18.5 fantasy point per game average throughout those 3 games. That in itself gives me so much confidence that not only is JuJu Smith-Schuster a pivotal part of this offense, but going forward is going to be a mainstay, especially when we're talking about a tight matchup going against a division rival. If in fact we're going to see JuJu Smith-Schuster out once again, Kadarius Toney, who we'll talk about in just a bit, will increase in terms of his overall ranking, but this is all under the assumption that we do see JuJu Smith-Schuster playing this upcoming week. And again, because of the fact that this team has not found themselves a red zone running back to go ahead and punch in majority of the opportunities, a lot of touchdowns have been attributed to JuJu Smith-Schuster, of course, Travis Kelce, and the scorelines of Kadarius Toney, McCole Hardman, because of the receiving work they're getting down in the red zone. There's a lot of opportunity within this offense, especially in this matchup. Moving on to our number 20, we have Chris Olave. Chris Olave, even though he has been extremely disappointing as of late, and Andy Dalton is going to remain as a starter according to Dennis Allen, the head coach of the New Orleans Saints, I absolutely believe that there is a lot of upside here. Just looking at the last couple performances of wide receivers going up against the secondary, specifically this last week, Rondale Moore, 9 catches, 94 yards, and of course DeAndre Hopkins, 10 catches, 98 yards. Both those guys with Colt McCoy were able to dice up this defense. So if Colt McCoy, a backup quarterback, can get the job done, I believe a backup quarterback like Andy Dalton could get the job done, specifically with his number 1 receiving option, Chris Olave. A couple things that I want to remind you guys of. Because of the fact that there is no more Cooper Kupp in this offense, and potentially they may even hold out Matthew Stafford because this offensive line for the Los Angeles Rams is decimated. This is only going to give more and more opportunities for the New Orleans Saints to get the ball back and get opportunities to score, which will eventually lead to more fantasy points for Chris Olave. This upcoming week via Prize Picks, his number for more or less on a given number is 57.5 receiving yards. Quite frankly, I think he's going over that number in this given week. Moving on. Let's talk about Amari Cooper. Even though Amari Cooper is one of the best wide receivers in the league in terms of fantasy points contributed, there is always the conversation that is going to be brought to center stage in regards to his away games. This season, in the 4 away games that he has played, he has only had himself 10 catches for 132 receiving yards. And even though this specific home and away split doesn't give you the full spectrum of the scope as to the situation here, it does kind of seep into my mind and make me think, well, you're going up against the Buffalo Bills, and it's an away game, and we're potentially going to see a snow game, which may impact Amari Cooper. Now, in the case of a Stefon Diggs, I have to start him regardless of whether it's snowing. But in the case of an Amari Cooper, I may be more selective on the matter, considering the specific coverage with Tre'Davious White potentially returning this week, and of course, an away game, in a weather game that may not be in his best overall position to succeed. Moving on to Gabriel Davis. Speaking of the matchup, like I just mentioned, if in fact we're going to see a snow game here, we could end up seeing Gabriel Davis once again be another one of these volatile plays. Thus far this season, he has had 4 boom and 4 bust plays. And what I mean by that, thus far this season, he has had 4 performances of less than 5.5 fantasy points, while he's also had 4 performances of more than 14.5 fantasy points. He's got himself great upside. And even in this last weekend's game against the Minnesota Vikings, that interception that was thrown to Patrick Peterson in overtime was directed towards Gabriel Davis. They want to get him involved in the red zone, specifically as a receiving option. That's where he scored his first touchdown this last weekend. I just believe that his volatility, the potential for this weather to be a problem, this all could be variables that keep him lower in my given rankings this week. Moving on to Deebo Samuel, taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Listen, Deebo Samuel is here, while Brandon Aiyuk is in that top 12 conversation, mainly because Deebo Samuel, yes, he's been consistent at times, getting himself over double-digit fantasy points for, quite honestly, the majority of the season. But he really hasn't been that impactful thus far. He's only had 1 top 20 wide receiver performance this season out of the 8 games that he has played. And that was a 20-point game against the LA Rams defense, which you always find success against. But that being said, the fact that he's only been in that top 20 conversation once leads me to kind of thinking, this is an offense where he's going to be the jack of all trades guy. He's going to be someone that they can use out of the backfield, they can use in the slot, they can use out wide, they can use anywhere, and he'll find success with him. So there's not a singular position where they're going to funnel targets in his direction. Even though I'm hoping that to be the case, I believe Deebo Samuel's overall upside is a little bit lesser going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Arizona. Moving on to Christian Watson. Again, the rookie wide receiver needs to be mentioned within the top 24 because, quite frankly, he's really talented. He's got all of the intangibles. He has size, he has speed that you just really can't teach anyone. Now, it's a matter of him getting more and more of a rapport with Aaron Rodgers to be able to develop on what they've already built thus far. But going forward, I have a lot of hope that he can go ahead and put together a great performance in Week 11, specifically in a short week against the Tennessee Titans secondary. We talked about it with Allen Lazard. There's a lot of injuries that is plaguing this defense, whether it's up front on their defensive line or even in their secondary, that absolutely Aaron Rodgers will be able to take advantage of. Now, even though he caught 3 touchdowns this last week on 4 receptions, he could have even had himself 5 receptions and 4 touchdowns if it wasn't for the fact that he looked back at the quarterback instead of up in the air towards where the ball was, which would have easily led to a touchdown. That all being said, when I talk about the rapport with him and Aaron Rodgers, I want to take into account and kind of present to you guys a couple numbers. As of thus far this season, Aaron Rodgers leads all quarterbacks in terms of passing attempts of 20 or more yards down the field. He is the number 1 in terms of passing attempts, deep passing quarterback. Now that you go ahead and have your deep passing receiving threat pretty much establish himself when they needed him most, it's a fantastic position. Not only that, they knew that they were going to utilize Christian Watson at that capacity last week, mainly because the first 2 passing attempts from Sunday's game both went in the direction of Christian Watson. I think he's in a perfect position to succeed going into Week 11. Moving on, let's talk about Kadarius Toney. Like I mentioned earlier, if JuJu Smith-Schuster does not participate, we are absolutely moving up Kadarius Toney into that top 20 conversation, if not higher. The way that they utilized him was purely the same way that they utilized Mecole Hardman in weeks past. If Mecole Hardman's going to be out, that obviously helps Kadarius Toney. When they got down into the red zone, jet sweep option, nobody covered him, they threw him the ball, open touchdown, no problem. Once again, jet sweep option, hand him off the ball, ran for 30 yards. Another play in which instead of having the pre-snap motion of the jet sweep, they have him run across the formation underneath behind the offensive line, dump off the pass, goes for another 20-yard play. Because Andy Reid is utilizing him in this specific fashion of getting him a full head of steam, of full sprinting as one of the most elusive receiving options in the National Football League, it's very difficult for people to stop him, to be able to catch up to him, and of course, not just completely miss when they're trying to make that first initial tackle. Moving on, let's talk about number 26, DeVonta Smith, taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Like I mentioned with specifically A.J. Brown, this is a tougher matchup. Isaiah Rodgers, Stephon Gilmore, 2 of the best cornerbacks in the National Football League right now in terms of coverage grades, according to Pro Football Focus. And really, they haven't given up much. That being said, If in fact we're going to see a scenario where AJ Brown may be a little bit limited with the hamstring tweak that he had on Monday night, if that's going to bother him in any sort of capacity, we could see DeVonta Smith as the number one option. We know Dallas Goedert's on the IR. There's so many more targets within this offense that could be available to him regardless of coverage. He'll find himself open in a lot of scenarios. Moving on, let's talk about Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney has an absolutely fantastic matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. Just giving you some perspective as to why this is one of the best matchups at the position. Of course, Josh Palmer a couple of weeks back, 8 catches, 106. Of course, we saw a guy like DJ Moore, 6 catches, 152 and a touchdown. Tyler Boyd, 8 catches, 155 and a touchdown. Brandon Aiyuk, 8 catches, 83 and 2 touchdowns. Jamar Chase, 8 catches, 130 and 2 touchdowns. Now, besides the fact that it's an advantageous matchup, we do have the fact that Justin Fields, over the course of the last couple of weeks 5 through 10, has been a significantly better passing quarterback. Throughout that span of time, he has completed 10 passing touchdowns, and that's all we need. We just need one of those touchdowns to go in the direction of Darnell Mooney to make himself a fantastic top 24 option. Moving on to Joshua Palmer. If Josh Palmer does not have the services of a Mike Williams or Keenan Allen available for them this week, he's going to be the number one, as per usual. And yes, he may not be able to have those ultimate touchdown plays or go over 100 receiving yards every single contest, but going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, I expect him to find success because in the last 4 games that Justin Herbert has taken on this division rival, he has averaged 3 passing touchdowns per game against them. This is going to be a very high-scoring event between these two teams, regardless of who we see as the starting wide receivers for these teams. Moving on to DJ Moore. Even with Baker Mayfield at quarterback and Baker Mayfield having some sort of experience with the Baltimore Ravens because he played for the Cleveland Browns and they were, playing each other twice a year, I'm still a little bit worried about DJ Moore. With Baker earlier this season, he's averaged only 7.62 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format. And yes, in the last 2 games where Baker was a starting quarterback, he targeted DJ Moore 11 times and 8 times. Those are great numbers, but if half of those total targets are in the ground, 10 yards over his head, out of bounds, in the defender's lap, it is not worth much to me. So as of right now, I'm hoping that we get into a position where maybe in this game they replace Baker Mayfield with Sam Darnold because, quite frankly, we have seen good, overall performances between DJ Moore and Sam Darnold together, while we really haven't seen that with Baker Mayfield in his wide receiver one. Moving on, let's talk about our number 30, Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen hasn't scored a touchdown in quite literally 3 games. We've talked about this in weeks past. Throughout the course of his entire career, he has never gone more than 3 games without scoring a touchdown. This is the week. And quite frankly, of all the weeks to go ahead and put up a great performance, why not against the Dallas Cowboys? I mean, the Dallas Cowboys most recently have given up 3 passing touchdowns to Aaron Rodgers, 2 to Justin Fields, and 2 to Jalen Hurts. Great performances across the board. And when we talk about the history of Adam Thielen against this Dallas Cowboys defense, of course, most recently in the last 2 seasons, 28.3 and 16.8. Great overall performances. I'm expecting him to potentially find the end zone this week. Fingers crossed. Moving on to Diontae Johnson, number 31. I understand that Diontae Johnson is extremely underwhelming. And yes, he still has 81 total targets, which is in the top 10 of the wide receiver position right now, and only a 58% catch rate. It's unbelievable how inaccurate the rookie quarterback Kenny Pickett and Mitchell Trubisky has been as a duo. But in the last 4 games that he has taken on, Diontae Johnson has taken on the Cincinnati Bengals secondary, 15.9, 20.6, 14.0, and 9.0. He's had himself good performances. You just got to get the ball in his direction at a far more successful rate than what we've seen thus far. And if we can do so, maybe, specifically down in the red zone, find himself his first touchdown this year. He's pretty much become the Miles Sanders of the wide receiver position for this year, specifically in terms of not being able to score a touchdown. All right, moving on to our number 32, we have Allen Robinson. I don't trust any wide receivers for the LA Rams going forward. I just want to preface that. That being said, Allen Robinson should see a target increase with Cooper Kupp on the injury reserve. But I don't know who's playing quarterback for them, and I don't know if they're going to have any sort of success. If, in fact, we see the LA Rams come out and not able to get more than 8 first downs in the singular game, I will not be surprised. I honestly think they're not going to win a singular game for the remainder of the year. With my lack of confidence in the organization, it then alludes to a lack of confidence specifically in Allen Robinson. I honestly do believe that the best receiving option within this offense is Tyler Higbee going forward, and that's probably where I want to go ahead and invest if I'm going after one of these receivers. Moving on, let's talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones, our number 33. Donovan Peoples-Jones has just been consistent. That's all he's been all season long. Since week 3, he's been averaging 9.46 fantasy points per game. And over the course of that time, he's only had 1 performance outside of the top 36 wide receivers. He's going to continue to have himself a number 33 to 36 performance, whether it's with just receptions and yards, and hopefully he finally catches an elusive touchdown. But as of right now, that consistency keeps him in this conversation. Moving on to Darius Slayton, our number 34. In the last 5 weeks, he has had 3 performances of over 10 points. In those games, 10.9 fantasy points, 13.3, and most recently this last weekend, 17.0, having himself 3 catches, 95 yards, and a touchdown. Takes on the Detroit Lions secondary that, of course, is one of the more advantageous matchups at the position. If Darius Slayton is going to be the primary number one within this offense, sure, he may get himself a little bit more opportunity here and there, but an offense that literally only threw the ball 17 times last week and ran the ball 47 times, it's not as much opportunity as other offenses, which makes it that much more of a sketchy overall play, but has upside considering his recent success. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, taking on the Washington Commanders. Brandin Cooks currently, in my opinion, could be a trustable option, but it is really tough to do so considering Nico Collins, Philip Dorsett, Chris Moore, they have all found success within this offense. They don't need Brandin Cooks to have a functioning offense. So Brandin Cooks could be a value. Hopefully he has a full week of participation at practice. There's no sort of injury that is going to, withhold him from practicing, because if he does, he's off this list. Currently via PrizePicks this weekend, 50.5 receiving yards. I might honestly be looking to go less than that number, because the only way that Brandin Cooks is in my lineup is if I'm hoping he scores a touchdown. Outside of that kind of a given week, very volatile. Moving on to the final option, it is Drake London, taking on the Chicago Bears defense, who again, like I mentioned earlier this week, has not given up less than 31 total points to an opposing offense in the last 3 contests. We should end up seeing the Atlanta Falcons and their offense put together a great performance. Specifically, Marcus Mariota in the passing game, looking in the direction of Drake London last week. 6 total targets, 5 catches, even scored himself a touchdown in that contest. This upcoming week via PrizePicks, his number is 38.5 receiving yards. I think this is a very achievable number overall. And that's where we're going to finish it for today. I want to thank you guys for watching. Again, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks, you can pick more or less on a given player statistic, put together some entries. We talked about some players today. Check that out today via the NFL. There's a link down in the description. When you use promo code ANDREW and sign up making a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So they basically double your first-time deposit. So if you deposit 50, they'll match it with 50. You deposit 20, they'll match it with 20. Check that out today. Have some fun via Daily Fantasy, via PrizePicks. That's going to cover it. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Click the like button down below. Let me know down in the comments if there's any player that are missing that I did not mention. Tomorrow, we'll talk about tight ends and quarterbacks. And until then, I'll see you guys. Peace.